As we all know by now, with Jade Shadows, there has been a status rework. More specifically, the one that has caught all of our eyes is Blast. Blast is super fun at the moment, and I think everyone is really enjoying themselves with their testing. So in this video, I'm going to be going over how Blast works, and then also recommending weapons for you to try out with the new Blast meta. So firstly, how does the new Blast work? Well, instead of lowering enemy accuracy, Blast now detonates, causing a mini explosion dealing 30% of the damage dealt after 1.5 seconds when it is procced on an enemy. If you reach 10 stacks, or the enemy dies before that, all stacks will detonate at once and enemies within 5 meters are dealt 300% of the base damage. So in short, Blast is blasting, which honestly is super satisfying. But here is the thing with Blast. While on paper this is great, Blast actually works the best when you have a weapon that can apply multiple procs in rapid succession to enemies that are tightly grouped together. This is because the Blast procs, when you either reach max stacks or kill them before you reach max stacks, will deal way more damage, and it will create a chain reaction in a sense with the bigger 5-meter explosion when you do this. Beam weapons are pretty much the best pick for this, specifically beam weapons that chain to multiple enemies at once. Group them together and you get an even deadlier combo. Although it's not limited to beam weapons entirely, there are other options out there. Technically speaking, any weapon that has decent status chance that can be modded, and preferably a weapon that has either innate cold or heat, as you need heat and cold to create Blast. On the same note, Blast actually works better if you can armor strip your enemies. The nice thing about the status rework is they have changed how the health types and damage types work, and so on. So the damage boost you get from corrosive is no longer determined by whether the enemies have armor or not. It is now a faction damage multiplier as shown here. However, this only now applies to Grineer and Kuva Grineer enemies, not to other factions. So sadly, corrosive has technically been nerfed, in the sense you no longer get the general damage boost from it like we did previously. Now it only affects the factions it is strongest against. So modding corrosive with Blast works really well against Grineer enemies with armor. With the other factions like Infested or Corpus, you can get away with just Blast. For general armored enemies, you would need to either mod for corrosive or armor strip your enemies when it comes to steel path enemies. However, there is one issue with modding for corrosive and Blast. You are effectively modding for 2 elements, which means you're going to have to sacrifice 4 mod slots in your build just to get these 2 elements. So what does this exactly mean? It just means that you need to be sure that the weapon that you are modding for both of these elements will be able to deal enough damage because you're taking up so many mod slots. For the most part, it should. If you are wanting to free up 2 mod slots, you can potentially make use of Hydroid or Sarin to give you corrosive with Blast, to allow you to have more flexibility to mod your weapon. Or alternatively, you can make use of Ember with her augment Fireball Frenzy, which will add heat damage to the Blast you mod for on your weapons. And you can even make use of Gauss's Subsume with the augment, which will create Blast for you through cold and heat. You can honestly get very creative with this. It's all up to you and how you want to build your weapon. Blast will also work better against enemies who are armor stripped, so using frames or subsuming armor stripping abilities onto your frames will be the best option if you don't want to mod for corrosive, and also if you're fighting against non-Grineer enemies. Now that we have gone over how Blast works, let's actually go over the best weapons to use with Blast. But before we do that, if I could ask if you could hit that like button, as it really helps me out with the algorithm. Thank you so much. Just a quick disclaimer here, for all the builds that you see here with corrosive, those are the builds that are for Grineer enemies. If you're fighting against normal factions or other factions, you can make use of something like this as a template. Right off the bat, the Torrid. I mean, you already guessed it, most likely. The Torrid is arguably one of the best day-to-day weapons to use at the moment, and now even more so with the new Blast rework. The sheer amount of damage this weapon can do, and now add Blast, it's blasty indeed. I modded for corrosive and Blast, and honestly it doesn't get old. Torrid is really good, and it just gets better and better. The next weapon is the Burst On. Contradicting what I said earlier about beam weapons and Blast not being good for single target weapons, the Burst On still holds up because of its insane amounts of fire rate and decent status chance. Modding it for corrosive and Blast will hold up quite well, and it is super satisfying to see you rip through everything. Quick disclaimer, technically corrosive heat is better, but Blast is really fun, and we just want Explodey, so who cares if you do a little less damage. The next weapon is the Blast-Tasma. The Phantasma has always been a good status hose, and adding Blast onto it, look at it. It's super satisfying to use. you know, it's great. This is what the build looks like. You're more than welcome to change it up to other elements, but right now Blast is fun. The Strun Incarnon, again, a status powerhouse of a weapon, so adding Blast to it will make it even more satisfying than it was before. Here is the build we run for this one. Up next, we have the Mitre. The Mitre is a special case here and makes Blast super satisfying. You're not going to get max stacks with this weapon, but what makes it so good is the fact that A, the Mitre has a homing projectile with the Incarnon, and B, the very high base damage this weapon does will basically kill enemies so quickly that it will proc the explosion, which means this weapon relies on actually killing the enemies before it gets to 10 procs. Regardless, the weapon obviously performs better with enemies that are closer together. Here is the build that we run for the Mitre. The next primary we have is the Fenmore. Now the Fenmore is again not ideal. Technically, it's a single target weapon. However, because of the massive amounts of damage we get from the Incarnon evolutions, the Fenmore explosions deal a considerable amount of damage. So pairing this with Blast makes it quite an interesting single target explodey weapon. This is the build that I run for the Blastmore. For the last primary on this list, we have the Tenet Glaxion. The Tenet Glaxion is one of the new Tenet weapons, and it is a beam weapon that now chains to multiple enemies with decent status chance. Plus, you can have a progenitor on it, which means you can either go for heat or cold on it to further increase the blast damage. Here is the build I run for the Tenet Glaxion. I will say I chose the wrong progenitor for this weapon, which is why I have radiation on it, so just ignore that. That pretty much concludes primaries for this list. I am really interested to hear what weapons you guys have been enjoying with Blast. Pop them in the comments below and I will check them out in game. Now let's move on to secondaries. The first one on the list is the Tenet Cycron. The Tenet Cycron is a perfect fit for Blast, a beam weapon that applies many status effects and chains to nearby enemies. And it is a Tenet weapon allowing you to choose whichever element you want. So just like every other Blast setup, we have this build here. The Kuva New Core is the Kuva version. This honestly comes down to personal preference between the Kuva New Core and the Tenet Cycron. They are very similar weapons with the exact same build. If you're struggling to decide, guess what? I actually made a comparison guide a while back, and there you can make your decision which one you prefer. Next up, we have the Furus. The Furus in general is OP, but oh boy, does Blast with the Furus just get even better. The Furus Incarnon is a really good option because of the massive flat damage you get from this weapon. Plus, when built correctly, you can literally pop groups of enemies with this weapon, like delete them. So the Furus is the perfect option when it comes to using Blast. Here is the Blast build for the Furus. Moving on to probably my favorite weapon for Blast and also one of my favorite secondaries in general, and that is the Compressor. The bubble gun has explodey bubbles already. Add Blast onto it, and then you have even more explodiness. Yeah, I love this weapon in general, and Blast just makes it so much better in my opinion. Here is the Compressor build for you to run. Next up, we have the Ocucore. The Ocucore with Blast is something else. I'm struggling to decide which one I like more between the Ocucore and the Compressor. With the Augment Sentient Surge, the Ocucore paired with Blast makes for some really satisfying explosions because of the extra beams that proc with extra status chance from Sentient Surge. It just works so well together. And you can effectively have almost infinite ammo with the Augment as well. Here is the build that I run with the Ocucore. For the last secondary on this list, we have the Latum. With the Incarnon evolution, Blast works extremely well with this weapon. Plus, it has decent status chance as well, so you can proc multiple Blast procs easily. The thing is, the Latum is strong enough as is because of the 2000% extra damage, but the damage boost just increases the Blast procs drastically. This will also work really well with tougher targets as it is more explodey and more satisfying. Here, I would recommend running this build for the Blatum. That pretty much concludes secondaries. We now move on to melees. There are two main ones here that I want to focus on, the Zorus and the Halicar. Both are glaives. Now the Zorus is pretty much broken with any element for that matter. The thing is, this thing is just broken. However, with Blast, it is particularly satisfying when pairing it with melee influence, because the Zorus applies innate electricity, meaning you will proc melee influence often. Here is the build we run for the Zorus. This thing literally pops groups of enemies. It's great. Similarly, the Halicar has innate blast, which you can build onto and add electricity to make use of melee influence as well. Again, pops enemy groups. I'm sure there are other melees that are out there which I haven't yet tested, especially with the new arcane melee affliction, or with melee influence, whichever one tickles your fancy. But for now, those are the two main melees that I personally would use when it comes to Blast with melees. I do want to talk about beginners who are watching this video. The majority of the weapons that I showcased in this video are more geared towards endgame players, but for those of you who are newer to the game and want to experience Blast earlier on, you can pretty much adapt the same thing that I explained earlier on in the video for your weapons. Try and lean more towards high status based weapons and modding for Blast or modding for Blast and Corrosive, which will boost your damage considerably. To be honest, most of the early games are okay until you start hitting above MR8, then you start to get the nice weapons. However, I would recommend getting your hands on either the Kuva Nucor or Tenet Cycron when you finish the War Within questline, because then you get access to Kuva and Tenet weapons, and they are the perfect weapons to start blasting early on in the game. You don't have to use all the fancy mods, a simple budget build paired with the right elements will work perfectly with Blast for Star Charts, and of course will be cheaper on Forma. Otherwise, to conclude this video, Blast is super fun at the moment and way more satisfying. Because of all the final changes to the status reworks, I am actually now going to be continuing my beginner's guide series, as hopefully DE doesn't fiddle too much with the base mechanics anymore. That concludes the video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. And as always, a massive shout out to all of our channel members. You guys are amazing. Thank you so much. I will see you all in the next one.